Before I get into some of the issues around this story, there's a point that I'd like to make, um, which is that in the UK, there's a huge amount of interest in American stories or things going on in the United States. You know, you look at any British political forum, and you can guarantee a segment of that will be about American politics, even more so than other countries. And I think there's a few reasons for that. Obviously, our close ties to the United States, but also I think because the culture wars have come to this side of the Atlantic as well. But I think we also have to be careful not to sort of assume that what is the debate in the United States is going to be exactly the same debate here. And what I'm going to talk about now is something that is highly unlikely to happen in this country on the grounds that, for one thing, we don't have the same problem with gun violence, and secondly, I think that some of the areas around the debate differ somewhat. Um, that's not to say we wouldn't have hate crime in this country, but I do think there's a different dynamic. So I just want to put that caveat. The United States and the United Kingdom do have a lot of differences, and just because there's an interest in things going on in the States doesn't mean it's exactly the same here. Although I do think the culture wars sometimes spills over. So, I'm talking, of course, about the mass shooting in and around Atlanta a few days ago. Actually, that happened the very same day I made a video about the Dunblane 25th anniversary, so that's a tragic coincidence. I'd actually been thinking it did seem like a while since there'd been a mass shooting in the United States, comparatively speaking. But sadly, this broke that little interlude of relative absence of mass shootings since 2019. I mean, that's thinking of it in that way is like 2 years. Whoa, that's a long time by American standards, but in any other country that would still be frequent. Anyway, on this occasion, the issue isn't the gun debate. On this occasion, the issue is motivation. And the mass shooter, Robert Aaron Long, what caused him to commit this carnage? 8 people killed, one person injured. Um, so what do we know? We know that he carried out the shootings at, I think it was 3 locations around metropolitan Atlanta. And unfortunately, it's now been heavily politicized. In large part, I think because of the backdrop that there has been an increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans. And I don't think there's any dispute about that. I don't think you could say, oh, well, they're all just muggings or they're all. I do think there is genuinely a rise in anti Asian sentiment. Um, I think some of that is resentment at the Chinese government, and of course, that's a moronic conclusion for the attackers if that's their motivation to attack ordinary people in such thuggish and cruel ways. Is There's no place for it. And racism is racism. I will always condemn it. Um, but notably, the attacks have been carried out by both white and black thugs. So some have tried to frame this as combating white supremacy or white racism. But what about black racism? Will Black Lives Matter have expressed their condolences to victims? Very good. Will they condemn black racists who are also involved in the attacks? I wouldn't bank on it. Um, if Black Lives Matter is all about civil rights for black people and saying that Black Lives Matter, should they not be responsible and say, well, we are not a black exclusive organization. We are also caring about other people. Therefore, we're going to condemn black racists. Now, obviously, in this case, the suspect is white, but there is a big problem with tagging it automatically as a racially motivated incident. Facts are that 6 of the victims are Asian women. 2 of them, I understand, are white men. I think it's a bit disrespectful to those 2 white victims to just ignore them and pretend that they're not also victims. But that is a fact. 6 of the victims are Asian women. So there are people having a knee-jerk response of it. Well, they're Asian women. This was a white guy. It must have been a hate crime. I would support that idea if there was more evidence that that was the case. as it stands, the shooter himself has said that it wasn't the motivation. Well, people like Trevor Noah have jumped in and said, "Oh, are we going to believe his word for it?" Well, I would say look at other cases where there has clearly been a racial motivation. Look at Anders Breivik in Norway. Look at Dylan Roof in South Carolina. Look at Brenton Tarrant was more religious hate, like his hatred against Muslims, but you can find lots of examples. David Copeland in the UK, the Soho nail bomber, they were all white supremacists or far right activists, and there was other empirical evidence that that's what they were. They were members of fringe organizations, they frequented far right websites, they pushed far right conspiracy theories. With this guy, so far, there's no indication that he is linked to any of those sort of groups. That's why it's premature to say it's racially motivated. And unfortunately, the narrative in America is always hijacked over the story. So now it's, oh, well, you're just saying that because he's a white guy. And there's this argument: if it's a black shooter, he's a terrorist or a Muslim shooter, but if it's a white guy, we need to find excuses. It's not about finding excuses. What he's done is horrendous. And I understand Georgia has the death penalty, so he'll probably be eligible for that. Um, it's not about sympathizing with the killer or trying to find excuses. It's about knowing what the narrative is. Now, we also know that this guy was a sex addict and he came from a devout religious background. I don't know what particular branch of the church or if it was like an offshoot of something or what, but this is an ongoing investigation. So for people like Trevor Noah who have a position of influence, just come out and say, "Oh, it was definitely a hate crime against Asians." That's reckless, and I think it's fanning the flames of tension in the United States. Politicians have been a little bit more careful. Um, Kamala Harris has said that the investigation is ongoing and we don't know, but it seems likely. I think politicians need to be very careful. They need to obviously condemn what happened. They need to express concern about the very real, or rather express understanding of the very real concerns that Asian Americans have. But one interesting viewpoint is from Tracy Kwan. Now, she has written for a lot of publications on the rights of sex workers. I'll see if I could get a quote here from the Wikipedia article. Bear in mind, this is an ongoing investigation, so anything could change. But where was it? Yeah, columnist Tracy Kwan commented on the incident from her perspective as an Asian American and a former sex worker. Untangling the suspect's motive isn't easy when race and sex are competing to dominate the narrative. I've experienced bias and ethnic profiling, but I've also been a sex worker and I've encountered more prejudice, more name calling, more fear, anger, and hostility in connection with my sex work than regarding my race. So that's interesting. It would suggest that the narrative being spun by the left that this must have been racially motivated might not be the whole picture. I think that it is very unfortunate that it has come at a time when there are a rising number of attacks on Asian Americans and the optics are there. It's a white suspect and predominantly Asian victims, but um, I think it's reckless to just say it was a hate crime because the victims were Asian. That's like saying any sort of confrontation between people, if people happen to be from different backgrounds, then that must be the motivation rather than, and I'm not saying this is the case with the Atlanta shootings, but rather than maybe they've just had an argument that got out of hand. Let me just throw out a scenario. Let's say you had a violent husband, right? And he was white or he was black and he had an Asian wife. And let's say he killed her one day. Would that be racially motivated? No, I think it would be more, all the obvious conclusion would be it's domestic violence. Um, so just because there is a scenario where victims are of a certain demographic and the perpetrators of another demographic, shouldn't conclude that that is definitely the outcome. And people like Trevor Noah, I think they should be ashamed of themselves for stirring the flames without knowing the facts. Um, it's really unfortunate because it won't help anyone. It will increase fear among Asian Americans. It will, you know, further the narrative that America is a terrible racist country. It's just, it's a lot of distortion. And this is dangerous when the narrative supplants the news and the facts. Of course, none of this is to say that he is not motivated by hate crime. He might have been. But my instinct is that if he was, it just seems very unlikely that he wouldn't say so. Because far right extremists tend to be proud of their dirty work. They tend to be very vocal about it. So I just think that when you weigh everything up, it's far more likely that this was motivated by misogyny or by a grievance, a grudge against the sex industry. Now, some of the handling of it hasn't helped matters. For example, apparently the police captain involved, Jay Baker, of the Cherokee County Sheriff's Department, said Long told police, and this is paraphrased, he was pretty much fed up and kind of at the end of his rope, and I guess it was a really bad day for him, and this is what he did. The phrase really bad day attracted online criticism and led to the discovery of Baker's anti China sentiments on Facebook, thereby calling the integrity of the investigation into question. Well, I don't know what anti China sentiment means, but that was certainly a very undiplomatic statement. Even if he was paraphrasing the suspect, when you're a police chief, you need to be careful with sensitivities and things like that. So I think that was crass because it sounded almost sympathetic to the shooter. This thug has killed 8 people, and he should get the maximum sentence available. Um, he's destroyed, he's killed 8 people, but he's destroyed many other lives. That's always the thing with spree shootings we hear about, so many people killed and injured, but then there's extended families, of course. But there's a lot of factors at play in this case. I understand a lot of the women involved in this industry might be unregistered migrants, therefore they might be worried about sort of working with the police in case their documentation becomes an issue. Um, so there's a lot of issues at play, but people just rushing to say it's definitely racist should be ashamed of themselves. They don't know that. They just don't know that. And I think it fans the flames unnecessarily. Um, right, so I'll leave it there. But it's very sad. It's very sad, and I hope that scumbag realizes the pain that he's caused all around and the tensions that he's caused by doing this. I think that if there is some sort of misogynistic or religiously based motivation, then whatever church he's involved in needs to be investigated to see what sort of things they're teaching, see if they're brainwashing young men into this sort of behavior. But that's not an excuse for his actions. He's responsible for his own actions, and I hope he faces the maximum penalty.